Yep, so it looks like everything is going good. Everyone joining us, I hope you're doing well. And today we're being joined by Vanessa. We're being
Okay.
joined by Vanessa, who is a student at Waterloo. We're going through web dev, React, and DevOps. I won't take too long. I'll let her start and show you guys along this wonderful stuff.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Vanessa. I'll be hosting today's intro to web dev, React, and DevOps workshop. And I'll be walking you guys through how to build a personal website or portfolio using React, and then how you can deploy it using GitHub Actions. And I'll be talking a bit about some different DevOps practices. So just some housekeeping items. If you want to follow along with this workshop, I suggest you try setting up Visual Studio Code, Node 16, NPM. Git is optional, recommended especially for the DevOps portion. And also the starter code repository, I believe, will be shared in the Discord. This is the link on the slide to the repository, which contains all the starter code and also final solutions if you want to compare later. One thing I will say is that it's good if you have like at least a basic understanding of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for this workshop, since I'm focusing on the React portion of it, which is really just JavaScript. If you aren't familiar with those languages, not to worry, you can still kind of follow along, especially if you have some background in coding. But if you get lost, these are some resources that I've linked that I found were very helpful when I was first learning JavaScript. And also some links to the React documentation, a YouTube tutorial that I think is really good. And if you're interested mostly in the DevOps portion of this workshop, it's going to be near the end of the React tutorial, like the last 15, 20 minutes. I have linked here some resources, some free courses by AWS and Azure, which are some really good tools to learn if you're interested in pursuing a career in DevOps, and some tools that I think are useful for learning, like Linux, Docker, and Bash scripting. A little bit about me. I'm in my third year of biomedical engineering. And when I started, since I've started university, I've done a few co-ops in web development. My first one was as a front-end developer for the government of Canada. And I was doing a bit of work last term in DevOps and back-end development. I'll just kind of jump right into the workshop portion. And one thing I wanted to kind of explain first was what exactly is full stack development and DevOps. If you ever want to think about a website, I can kind of break it down into three components. It would be your front end, your back end, and your database. So the front end of your website is what the user sees, is what they interact with. It's usually built with like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and you can use popular libraries like React to build your front end, and that's the library that I'll be focusing on in this tutorial today. And your back end of your website is kind of like the brain. It's everything that handles the logic, any computation, any processing. This is usually built using Python or Java. So if you think about, like, let's say an e-commerce website, your front end would be a page which would show different items that the user can purchase on that website. And your back end would be handling calls to your database to retrieve those items, retrieving prices for those items, how much is in stock, things like that. So between your front end and your back end, you can see here that your front end's hosted on, your front end is just like where the client is, their computer, and your back end is hosted on some server, which is external, and it runs your code on it, and it connects to your database. So your database is what stores data. It's your SQL. It's usually like a SQL database or a PostgreSQL database or MongoDB. I can't talk about all these different types of databases, but they're all good for different purposes. But the general thing is that you would write queries in your backend code, which would retrieve data from your database as the user wanted or based on your program. So I know that was a lot of information. So kind of like high level, all you really need to know is the user interacts with the front end. They, let's say, visit your web page, and it sends a request, which is communicated to your backend via something called an API, an application programming interface. Your backend code will process that request, and it retrieves the data from the backend, and then might perform some computations on that data so that it's packaged up nicely and sends it back as a response to your front end where it displays that data. I believe there's a workshop on APIs, which kind of dives more into that portion of it. But for this workshop today, I'm focusing mainly on the front end and also something called DevOps. So DevOps stands for development and operations. It's a really large field. It's more so of a methodology that encompasses practices in software development that focus on improving the software development lifecycle. So automating tests. So a really big part of it is quality assurance. So automating your tests, automating version controlling, also automating deployments. And also a lot of the stuff that is in DevOps is working in cloud environments. So deploying your applications to these cloud environments so that you're not restricted to a single device or a single computer. I also linked here at the very bottom of this slide a link to a full stack developer guide. It just kind of outlines any tools that would be helpful in learning. But yeah. So this workshop, as I said, focuses on React, which is a front-end JavaScript library for building front-end interfaces. It's used by a lot of companies like Twitter and Facebook, so it's very popular. There are other libraries like Vue or Angular, which are also quite popular. And anyone can learn it as long as you have hopefully a good grasp of JavaScript. So I find that's very helpful to learn before you start. And in terms of like why we should learn React, it's a very popular front end library. And it allows you to build complex websites faster by using something called components, which I'll be talking a bit about later. And there's also a lot of other useful features. As you know, like if you're coding with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, things can get very bulky and really repetitive really fast. So React kind of takes a lot of that out of the equation by providing interactive components for like making things like buttons and things like that, or managing state between your components. So if you want to figure out how many times a button was clicked, these are all very basic examples, but it kind of gives you an idea of what can be done with React. So yeah, this is going to be the coding portion of the workshop. You can follow this live. Again, I'll actually be walking through, I believe, in the next videos, like how to install Node, npm, set up your environment a little bit. Again, the starter code is inside the GitHub repository, so make sure you clone that so you can follow along. And I will turn off my camera and mute and just play the video. This is like pre-recorded, so it's a bit easier to follow along. But yeah. So for the first part of today's demo, we're going to be walking through how to create a React app. We're going to be following the instructions on the official React documentation. So you can go to reactjs.org, then under the Docs tab, create a new React app. It lists the instructions here that we're going to be following. So we're going to have Node and npm installed first, which is a prerequisite for this workshop. You can check that you have Node installed and npm installed correctly by going to Visual Studio Code. Right now, I've opened up a folder which I've created on my desktop called Technova DIY React website, and this is just the folder we'll be working out of for the duration of this demo. So I'm going to be creating a terminal, new terminal at the top here, and it opens up a terminal right here. I'm going to type node-v, and the version number pops up, which means it's installed correctly. And npm-v, the version number pops up again, and it's the correct one, so we're good to go. We're going to start by following the instructions listed here. So to create a project, run the following commands. We're going to run this command here, npx create react app. We're going to rename the project instead of my app to my personal website. And while that's loading up, I want to talk a bit about what React is and how we're going to be building components. So a component is a building block for a website. You could have a button component, a header component, a landing page component. And inside of components, you could have even smaller components. So if you have a landing page component, you could have a header component, a subheader component, a profile picture component, or even a social media component, which could be like the LinkedIn logo, the Gmail logo, with some links attached to it to your socials. So what's really good about these components is two things: modularity and reusability. So with reusability, what you can do is code a button component once, and if you want to make changes to it, you can make changes to that one component file, and it reflects across all instances of that component in your website. Or let's say if there's like a bug in your component, if you're using this button component throughout your entire website, if you change the file, you can fix any bugs once and it works really well. So it makes development a lot faster. And the second thing is modularity. And the really good thing is by modularizing your website design and also making your code more modular by having by coding these individual components, it's a lot easier to maintain websites instead of having a huge page of HTML typed up. You have these smaller components which are a bit easier to maintain when you're developing, and it allows for you to build more complex websites faster. So you can see here that our project, My Personal Website, which is our React app, has been created. We're going to follow the instructions listed here. So we're going to cd My Personal Website, and this changes our directory to My Personal Website, the folder that was created. And then we're going to use the command npm start, which is a script created by the React project, which serves our website over localhost 3000. So you can see here, we can just open up localhost 3000 inside of a browser. We're going to open it up in Chrome. And if you see this page, that means everything's working properly. So this is our React app, and we're going to talk a bit about how this works. Why is this popping up? So you can take a look first. We're going to just kind of walk through the different files here. So we have our node modules, which is for our dependencies. And then we have here our public folder, which contains some assets, and it has an index.html file. So this is the default page of your website. Normally, if you were just coding with HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, you would write up all of your HTML here and build your website. So you would put like an H1 tag and you would say, this is my personal website. And you would add all your web content here. But instead, with React, all we have is a div with an ID root. So this is where React will inject our app into. And if you don't really get what that means, don't worry, I'll be explaining a bit more about what that is. So we're injecting our app into this root, and where that kind of starts is in this index.js file in our source folder. So this is where our React app kind of starts. It's looking for an element with an ID. So we get element by ID root, and this root element, we want to render inside of it our app. So you can ignore this tag, it's not too important, it's just for some debugging, but we can see that this app component is actually imported from this file here. And notice that I called it a component. So basically our React app is a component, a React component. We've imported it from this app.js file. And in React, what a component is it's basically a function. It's a JavaScript function. So you can see here we have an app function, which returns some HTML. And here in this HTML, you can see that there's some image logo, we have some text, and we have a link. And you can see that this HTML is exactly what's being rendered on our website on localhost 3000. So we're exporting this app, and when we import it, it basically returns all this HTML, and we're saying in our index.js, we want to render all of that HTML inside our root. So if we take a look at this localhost 3000 and we inspect it, we can see here that it's the index.html page that's being rendered when we open localhost 3000, and we have our root div here. Inside of our root div, we have our app component and the code for our app component, which is exactly what we saw over here. So to summarize, we are creating this app component, which is being rendered inside our this root div, and we're opening it on localhost 3000. So in the future, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating more components, and we'll be importing them here and then adding it into our app component, which will then be rendered inside of our index.html div component, div element. And inside here, we have some other files like our CSS for styling, some test files for checking if everything renders properly, and some other files here which aren't too important to this for this particular demo, but feel free to kind of look through it and experiment with it. Okay, so hopefully everyone was able to follow along with the setup. On to the next portion of the workshop. So walking through building a component, make sure you're using part 2 start inside the starter code repo. For part 2 of this demo, we'll be walking through a pre-made landing page component. And this session won't be a code along type of format, but instead I encourage you to clone the starter code repository, which is located inside the Notion agenda instructions, which we'll link in the chat. And you can either clone the repository if you have Git set up, or you can just download the zip and open it inside of Visual Studio Code. And for this part of the demo, we'll be using the code within the folder part 2 start. This code contains our starting landing page for our personal website. And I encourage you to listen along and play around with the files as I walk through them. Try changing up some values and getting a better understanding of how everything works and how the components are being rendered on the page. So to start, I'm going to open up a terminal. I'm going to change the working directory to the correct one, which is part 2 start. And I'm going to use npm start to launch the development server on localhost 3000 so that we can view our website locally. So I already have localhost 3000 open here. I'm going to just refresh it now that it's connected. And you can see here that we have our landing page. We have our headline, we have our socials, and we have our profile picture. So what exactly is happening and how is all this working? So let's start off with our index.js, which is the entry point for our React app. And you can see here, if you recall from what we learned in part 1 of this demo, we're getting this root element, which is a div located in our index.html file with an element ID of root. And we're inside this root, we're rendering our app component. Recall that components are the basic building blocks of our websites. It allows us to build parts of our website in isolation and reuse our components code. So you can see here that our app component is actually a JavaScript function, which returns some HTML. It returns also this landing page component. So to start off, you can see here that landing page is a function that again returns some HTML. We have a div with a style attribute, and we have some of this what looks like JavaScript. What these curly braces are is JSX. So JSX is a syntax extension to JavaScript. It basically says that whatever's inside the curly braces, treat it as a JavaScript expression and evaluate it before assigning that value or rendering that value. So here, how we're using JSX is to bind a value to this style attribute. So div style is actually a JavaScript object, which is right here, and it has an attribute called margin top with a value of 25%. Margin top, that property actually refers to the CSS property margin dash top. Notice that it will give you an error if you try using kebab casing, which uses these dashes in lowercase instead of camel casing, since in React, JSX is a lot more similar to JavaScript than it is to CSS or HTML. So we have to use camel casing instead. But here we're basically saying evaluate this variable and assign it to style. So if you've ever used HTML before, you know about inline styling, how you can assign like CSS values in this style attribute. So that's exactly what we're doing here. And JSX just says to evaluate this as a regular JavaScript expression. Instead of evaluating a JavaScript variable, you could also do like mathematical expressions like 1 plus 1, or it would evaluate 1 plus 1 to 2, and then it would assign that value. Or let's say you wanted to use like ternary operations. So you had some kind of Boolean called is a div, which evaluates to true if this element is a div or is not a div. Then if it's true, it would return the variable div style, and if it's not true, then we would return another variable called not div style. So that's kind of how JSX works, and it allows you to evaluate again JavaScript expressions within your HTML. So you can see here that this div, we're applying the styling on margin top 25%. And if you actually go into localhost 3000, you can see here inside of our body, we have our root ID. Then we have our div here, which exactly has that margin top property to it in our styling. And then you can also see that we have an image with the source property. We're evaluating this JavaScript import for profile pic so that it evaluates to an image URL, which gets rendered here, which is our profile picture. And then below it, we have two components. We have our About Me component and our Socials component being rendered inside of our landing page component. For part 2 of this demo, we'll be walking through just to kind of throw out some terminology, our landing page component is our parent component, and it has two child components, About Me and Socials. I'm going to first walk through Socials and kind of talk about what's happening in there before I move on to About Me. So Socials, again, is a component. Returns an HTML element, our div, and it uses JSX, again, to bind different styles to it using JavaScript objects. And then we also have some A tags surrounding these images. So we have 3 images, which are our social media logos with some links attached to it. And this socials component is exactly this row of image icons. So you take a look here, you can see that we have our div, and then we have our headline, and this right here is our socials component. So you can see here we have that div with style margin top 30 pixels, which is this div right here, and it's this styling, which uses JSX and JavaScript objects. That styling is located here, margin top 30 pixels. And then we have these 3 images below with some of our links attached. So that's our socials component. Let's take a look now at the About Me component because it's slightly different. You see here that we seem to be passing it these arguments called subtitle and headline. So this is where I want to introduce the concept of props. Props are how React components pass data from a parent to a child component. In this case, data is being passed from the landing page, the parent component, to the child component, About Me. How this works is About Me is a component, which is actually a JavaScript function, that accepts an argument called props. And props is a JavaScript object. And as you can see here, if you recognize dot notation, you have this property inside of props called headline. You have a property called subtitle, which matches these arguments that we're passing here. So just to kind of visualize it, props is basically a JavaScript object with a headline property, which is equal to the value, the string that we passed here. And we have a subtitle property, which is equal to the string passed right here. So if I copy that, that's basically what our props look like. I'll just comment this out so it doesn't cause any errors. But as you can see here, we're using, again, some JSX to bind these style objects. And then we're using JSX here to evaluate this JavaScript expression. Notice that we have to use JSX here because if we didn't use these curly braces, basically it's going to just read this as plain text, props.headline. And if we save that, you can see in localhost that it renders exactly that. So that's why JSX is super helpful. And as you can see, props allow us, again, to pass data from a parent to a child component. So it's a one-way data flow, and it means that props are read-only. So you can't modify the value of props. If you try to do like props.headline is equal to test, for example, it doesn't throw any errors here when you render, but you can see in the debugger, it's going to give you an error because React does not allow that. So you can't reassign props. They're just read-only. You can only read the values and use them. So now that we've introduced the concept of props for passing data from parent to child components, I want to talk a bit about data flow in general. And once you start building websites and you're building components, you're most likely going to have to be passing some sort of data between components or managing data within your component. And let's say that you have some kind of property that changes over time, and when it changes, you want to re-render the component accordingly. So that's where something called state comes in. And state is like a variable within your function, similar to how props are like arguments or parameters passed to your function. So if state is like variables declared with your function, if it changes over time, your component can read these new variable or state values and re-render the component accordingly. I'll talk a bit more and demo how that works in part 3 of this demo. But really, I wanted to introduce this idea because it's important to understand when to use different React tools for what cases. So in this case, you need to think about how your data is moving between components and whether props or state is a better solution for that. Just to kind Okay, so for the next part of this workshop, make sure you're looking at part 3 start in the starter code repo. Uh, and let's get started. So for part 3 of this demo, we'll be focusing on creating a card component for displaying our work experience on our personal website. I recommend that you clone this repository with the starter code, and we'll be working out of the folder part 3 start. So you can either use git clone or download the files and view it in Visual Studio Code. I already have that up and running. I even started the local host 3000 using the command npm start. So this allows us to view our website locally, and we can see that right here. So right now, the code is very similar to part 2 of our demo, where it's just the landing page. And what our work experience is going to look like is we're going to be displaying each of them inside of a card. And this card is going to have a header for our job title, a subheader for our company name, and a small description describing our role. So let's get started. So right now we're inside of our app component, and as you can see, it just has the landing page. And what we're going to do is we want to add another experience page component. So we're going to add a header, which is going to say my experiences. And then below it, we're going to include a component called experience page. So at the top, you can see that I have imported this experience page component. And it hasn't been created yet, which is why we're running into errors. So we can just create a new file under the components folder called experiencepage.js. And as you recall, React writes components, in React, we write components as functions. So we're going to write a function, which is called experience page. And this function is going to return an HTML element. So just as a habit, you always have to remember that you can only return one HTML element, so like a div. And this div can be wrapped around multiple HTML elements, but in the end, it has to be kind of like one entity. So in our experience page, similar to our card design, we're going to have some kind of H2 header, which is going to say our job title. And below it, we're going to have a P tag, which is going to be bolded, which says our company name. And below it, we'll have another P tag, which will display our description. But as you can see, now we're getting another error. And what this error is caused by is a missing export statement. So what you have to do is in each of your component files, you have to add an export default and then the name of your component. So that way, when you call it inside another component to render, you're actually importing this function and which returns the HTML element to render within our app component. And what I have open to the side is a file called experiences.js, which is located inside our source folder. And this file contains an array of our different experiences with our job titles, companies, and descriptions. Before I continue though, I'm just going to add the correct style classes, which have already been made inside this repository. I've added some styles to the index.css file. So you just have to apply the two classes card and cyan, and this will apply the appropriate styling to the card. So it's starting to look a lot more like what we want. So what we have at this point is an experience page component with one card inside of it. And ultimately, we want to be making multiple cards, one for each of our experiences. So it would actually make more sense to create a new component called card, which we can call as many times as we want inside the experience page component for each of our jobs or experiences listed. So I'm going to create a new component called card.js. So that's going to be a new file within the components folder, and then I'll just import it here and copy and paste the code I have right now for a card into that card component. And just to test that that card component works properly, I'm going to render it inside of our experience page component. And right now I have an error because I forgot the export default statement. But again, everything's displaying correctly. Nothing's changed since I'm still just rendering one card. But now looking at this, one thing I also want to change is instead of having the H1 header outside of our experience page component, it would make more sense to actually add that into our component. So that way our app file is a lot cleaner. And again, we can't return multiple HTML elements, so we have to wrap it around inside of a div. So that way only one entity is being returned. So So we want to render multiple cards. So one way of doing that is by simply copy and pasting that card component and rendering it multiple times. But the next step, to take it a step further, we want to map that data in the experiences.js file onto these components. And how are we going to pass this data into our card component? Well, the answer is props, because props allow you to pass data from parent to child component. So here we have our props object, and instead of using the hard-coded text we have here, we're going to replace it with our props variables. So we're going to say here our h2, we're going to use some JSX2 so that we render props.job title, and then again use JSX to render props.company name, and then props.description. So again, recall that JSX allows us to embed JavaScript within our HTML, and everything seems to be running successfully. And right now our cards don't have any props being passed to it, so it's just going to be an empty card. So as you can see here, if we were to call the card function each time, we would have to pass it our props. And that can get a bit messy really fast because these strings are going to be quite long, and then we have like up to like 10 cards, let's say. That's going to be a lot of props for passing in. We have to manually type out. So instead of doing that, we're going to use the JavaScript map function. And what map does is you call it on a JavaScript array, and it creates a new array by calling a function for every element within that array. So it calls that function once on each element. And I'm going to show it in action here to show kind of how it works and why it's useful for rendering multiple elements and mapping data from an array into these components. So here I've imported our experiences array from experiences.js, which is a file that's already included inside the repository. And I'm going to just remove these extra cards since we won't be needing that anymore once we use the map function. And I'm going to call the map function on the experiences array, and I'm going to pass it a function. And this function has one argument, which is element, and what this function returns is our card component. So basically what it's saying is that for each element within the experiences array, we're going to return a card component. And for each of these card components, we want to render different props. So for this case, we want to, for like the job title prop, we want to use JSX and bind to it the attribute of the element called title. So job title will equal to element dot title. And then company name is going to be equal to element.company, and then description is equal to element.description. And notice that title, company, description, these all refer to the attributes of of the objects in our experiences array. And then we're mapping it to our props, job title, company name, and description. And again, you have to use JSX to surround it like element.title, since this is like a JavaScript, it's like a JavaScript variable. And now, as you can see, one more thing to do is this entire like experiences.map is JavaScript within our HTML. So we actually have to wrap it up in JSX so that we treat this as a JavaScript expression that needs to be evaluated. And notice that's still an expression. It's still kind of like one command to be asked of JavaScript. So now what should be happening is we're mapping the experiences array into our card component, and we should have three cards, one for each of the objects inside of our experiences array being rendered with the correct data. And we can see here that it's successful. We have each of our cards with the correct job title and description and company name. And just to kind of reiterate the idea of what's happening, we're mapping the data from our experiences array using this function passed to our map function, which accepts an element in that array and returns a card component, which we've passed to it our elements data in the form of props to our card component. So far, we've been able to create a card component and render data from a JavaScript array into our components using the map method. And something that is an important topic to cover when learning React is the concept of conditional rendering. So for example, let's take a closer look at our array here. For each of our experiences, we have a property called active, which is either true or false. It's a Boolean. And when it's true, that means that this experience is currently ongoing and we want to display it. And when it's false, this is a past position, and we might want to not display it or add some kind of indicator saying that it's currently not like we're currently not actively involved with it. So only the second experience is false. So we're going to go through a few different methods of conditionally rendering this card component. So let's start by adding a prop. So one way of doing this is by adding a prop called, let's say, is active. So this is being added to the card component. And this would access the elements property called active. And this will be passed as a prop to the card component. So we can access this inside our card component from our props object. And there's a few different ways that we could conditionally render. So I'm going to start by using if statements, which is probably something that you're familiar with if you've coded with JavaScript before. But you could use an if statement and say if props.isActive is true, we'll want to return the same card that we've returned before. And else, we're going to slightly modify this card. So if props.isActive evaluates to false, instead of just returning this regular card, we're going to add another element to it, an h3, which is called props, which we're going to say add a title of past position, let's say. So this is what we've done so far. So we've added these if statements, and we've basically returned different HTML elements. And if we take a look at our localhost 3000, we can see here that, yep, the second position has that extra H3 and it says past position, and the other two are the same format. So it looks like our conditional rendering worked. Now, one thing that is a bit better practice to follow is instead of re-rendering and returning the entire component, you only want to re-render parts of your component that require it. So in this case, really the only thing that's changing is your H3, your div, your H2, your p tag, everything else is basically staying the same. So instead what we can do is only conditionally render the H3 heading. So I'm going to remove those if statements and just reformat my document. And in this case, there's a few different ways that we can re-render this, conditionally render this H3. So one method is using the ternary operator. So this is something in JavaScript, but it has this formatting of a condition, which evaluates either to true or false, then you put a question mark, and then you have some expression, which is evaluated when the condition is true, and an expression false, which is evaluated when the condition evaluates to false. So in this case, because this is going to be a JavaScript ternary expression, we had to wrap it all in JSX. So the condition would be props dot is active, and this prop will question mark. This prop will either evaluate to true or false, and if it's true, what we want to be rendered is nothing in its place. So we can just put a span element, for example, and this will basically render nothing in its place, and then colon. And if it's false, and if it's false, which means that the condition is not currently active, we want to render this H3 as a past position. So everything's saved, and we can take a look. And notice here, still same thing going on. We can even kind of change one of these values to check that it's still working. We're not just getting in false results. And notice here now we change it to false, and this H3 has changed. So now we have it here, and only the third one has no H3. So what this is basically doing is when this prop changes, when we're passing a new prop by changing this value in our experiences array, it only has to re-render, reevaluate this part. And it also makes our code a little bit cleaner. It's a lot easier to understand. So you can see that the rest of this component stays the same. I think I saw somewhere in the chat that the video is a bit blurry. It looks all right on like my end, like where I'm presenting, but let me know in the chat if it's still blurry. One thing though is that all the final solutions are posted in the GitHub repository, so you can refer to that too later. And the slides are shared too, so you can take a closer look at the videos there. So as you can see here, the ternary operator is good. So as you can see here, the ternary operator is good, but the only issue here is that we have this empty span element and it's not really doing anything. So this isn't the best practice to follow. Instead, we can use the logical AND operator in its place. So if you're familiar with JavaScript, you've most likely seen the logical AND operator in like an if statement where you have condition one, which is evaluated, and a condition two, which is evaluated. If both condition one and condition two evaluate true, then this entire expression evaluates to true. If they're both false, they evaluate to false. If either one of them are false, it evaluates to false. So how JavaScript compiles and processes this expression is it only looks at condition one first, and it evaluates it as true or false. If it's true, then they have to check condition two, because if condition two is true, it means this entire expression is true. But if it's false, this entire expression would evaluate to false. Whereas if condition one evaluates to false on the initial check, they won't even bother checking condition two because they know that because we're using the logical AND operator, if condition one is false, this expression will definitely evaluate to false. So we can use this behavior to our advantage. So here we're evaluating this condition props is active, and if props.is active is false, we want to render this H3 and say that it's past position. I'm just going to save this, and we're going to see what it looks like. So right now it seems that we're getting some unexpected behavior, right? We wanted past position on these first two experiences, not the last one, because these ones are false and this last one's true. This one is active, so it shouldn't be saying it's a past position. So the issue is we're not using the logical not operator. So let's kind of go through one case of this. So if we're looking at the first experience, active evaluates to false, and that's going to be past start is active prop. So um, this condition here will then evaluate to false, but this logical not operator makes it true. So because it's true, and remember the behavior of the logical and operator, it's going to have to look at the second condition to see if it's true. But keep in mind that any HTML element, it's going to always evaluate to true. It's never going to evaluate to false. So that means it's going to evaluate this, and it means that it's true. So it's going to actually render this HTML element. So for the first experience, we can see that the past position headings come up, and same thing for the second one, which has an active property of false. But for the last one, which is true, it evaluates this as true, but it becomes false. And then because this is false, it doesn't even bother looking at the second condition because of the behavior of logical and. So that's one other method as an alternative to the ternary operator for conditional rendering. So as you can see here, so now that we're mostly done with the demo, I wanted to talk about a few errors that you might have seen if you ran inspect element on the page and open up the console. So for the first warning, it says that each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So what is this talking about? Well, it says it's in the render method of the experience page. So if we head over here, the issue is actually here with the card component. So what happens when we're using experiences.map, what this does is experiences.map takes the experiences array and produces a new array. And this new array basically renders out the card components. So actually one way to kind of test what's happening here is I'm going to instead change this to console.log experiences.map. And this is going to print out the array that is produced by this JavaScript expression. So you can see here that it's a list of 3 objects with a lot of data in it, but each of these 3 objects basically represents a card. So this card element which is being rendered. So it's an array of these card elements which is being produced by this experiences.map method. So I'm going to just remove that console.log. But in this, and basically once when we render this list of elements, what it does is it basically just outputs each of the card components. So why do we need a key prop? It says in our warning that we should have a key prop which is equal to element.key. And as you noticed inside of our JavaScript array, we have this property key, and they just increment by 1, like 1, 2, 3. And you can kind of think of these keys as IDs for each of your card components. So basically this experiences.map is producing an array of card components, and how React reads this array of card components is it just renders each of those cards. But by adding this key, we're helping React identify whether any of these card components have changes made to it. So if a new props are passed to it, it should be re-rendered, or if a card has been added or removed from the list. So ultimately, these keys give each element inside the array a stable identity. And this key prop is just a special prop that is available for list rendering, and it's something that React recommends. And if you don't add this key prop, sometimes your list rendering might behave a little bit wonky. So it's a good idea to include and heed these warnings. So if we refresh Oh, hasn't page wasn't saved. But if we refresh, we can see now that that warning is gone. And this next error that came up, invalid DOM property class. Did you mean class name? So this is also on the experience page, in particular the card element. So it's saying that instead of using class, we should be using the property class name. And that is because we have to keep in mind that React is really a JavaScript framework. We're writing in JavaScript, not HTML here. I know that throughout the demo, I've been referring to these components as returning HTML elements, and while this eventually will be rendered as HTML, uh, we're really writing in JavaScript. This is a JavaScript function that we wrote here. So because class is a reserved word in the JavaScript language, and it could be confused with something else if we use class here, we have to use the word class name instead. So that way we don't get it mixed up with the CSS, like the CSS property class with the JavaScript keyword class. So class name is used here, and it still applies the correct classes for our CSS. And if we re-render, we refresh, we can see that the warning has disappeared. So now that we're mostly okay, so hopefully everyone was able to follow along. Again, all the resources are in the slides, so you can take a look at that later. And the starter code has final solutions in the repository. So yeah, after you complete your personal website, something that you probably want to do is deploy it. So you want to make it publicly accessible on a domain. Domains do cost money though. So if you wanted to host your personal website, a really good option is something called GitHub Pages. And that's a service provided by GitHub that allows you to publish HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files to a repository and host a static website. Static website being anything that doesn't have dynamic or changing content. So a dynamic site would be something like a blog or an e-commerce website, which is always changing its content and needs to be updated. So when you're deploying a React app to GitHub, though, it requires a few more steps. Mainly that when you have your React app, you notice in your package.json file, you'll have something called like a build script, and that will have to be run to put your React app in a deployable state. So then it would create a folder called build. I believe that's the name of the folder. And then you can publish that code to your domain and website. I'm not going to walk through the whole deployment process because it does take time to like load everything, and it's not possible within the hour. But this tutorial by Tanya is a really good resource. It covers all the steps that you'll need to do that. So yeah, let's say though that you want to take a step further. So with Tanya's tutorial, it's really good. But the thing with that is that you're going to have to manually deploy each time. You'll have to build and then publish your code and run some commands inside the terminal. But like what DevOps is really all about, it's all about a really big part of it is automation. So there's something called continuous integration and continuous deployment, where continuous integration automates everything up until deployment. So whenever you automatically push your code, it will automatically build your code. It will run some tests on your build to make sure it works. And continuous delivery and deployment, all talks about the same thing. It's all about anything related to deployments of your app. And the difference being, though, that delivery doesn't do this automatically. It just provides like code for making this process easier when you're doing it manually, versus deployment, which automatically does everything for you. And these two practices, delivery versus deployment, is useful in different cases. Continuous deployments usually used a lot with like test environments. So if you have your code in most like software companies, you're going to always want to push your new, like any updated code right away to your testing environment, so that your test QA developers can test the code and make sure everything's working. But you would want to use continuous delivery, where it doesn't do it automatically. It only does it when like a software developer approves of these changes and wants them to move to production, because your production environments where actual users who may be paying for your software are going to see these changes. So you want to make sure that they're working properly. And all of these practices are done using what we call pipelines. And usually they're coded in something called YAML, or it's spelled YAML. And pipelines are basically just code that outlines steps for continuous integration, delivery, and deployment. So it might include steps for building your code, testing your code, deploying your code. And since we've been using GitHub for this workshop, one really helpful tool is GitHub Actions. So if you go into your GitHub repository, there's a tab which is called Actions at the top, and they call it workflows here, but that's basically just a pipeline. So you can set up your own pipeline, and it's also using YAML. But they also have other templates here, which are very helpful. And GitHub Actions, it's basically a CI/CD platform. One thing, so from Tanya's tutorial, I provided here some steps on how you could build your own GitHub Actions pipeline. One note I want to say though is Tanya's tutorial outlines, it's the tutorial that I linked in a few slides ago. It outlines a few methods for deploying your application, one being where you build it and then publish it to a server. For this portion, like the part that I'm going to be talking about, I'm talking about the method she uses where it's deploying using NPM. As described in their article. So make sure you're following that. I outlined the basic steps here. So first being you have to add the homepage URL. Notice that the URL, this is like the domain is provided by GitHub for free with GitHub pages. So it's your username.github.io/the repository name. And you also have to add in the appropriate scripts. So you need a build script, you need a deploy script, so it runs npm run build, and then it uses the deploy script uses this package called ghpages. So make sure you have that installed, and you can install it as a dev dependency because you're only going to need it in your development environment, not in your production environment. And once you complete those steps, again, it's all described inside the tutorial I linked a few slides ago. This is what the code for your GitHub pipeline could look like. So you can see here that we have some like just the name of the pipeline. On this describes when the pipeline is triggered. So it's triggered on push, which means whenever you publish. So usually like you're coding on a laptop. You make your commits on GitHub, on Git, using Git, and then you want to push your changes to a remote repository. And that's like your GitHub repository. So that's where anyone can access the code, and you would push it, and it would trigger this pipeline. And inside this pipeline, we've defined different jobs, different steps inside of these jobs. So these steps are going to run on a virtual machine, which is basically a computer. And we said that we want to run it on an Ubuntu virtual machine. And then we have these steps here, which use Node, since we used Node for our project. You should change this version to 16. I believe we were using this tutorial. But it checks out your code. It installs dependencies listed in your package.json file. And then it runs your build script and it runs your deploy script. So you can imagine this is a lot easier than manually doing this every single time you have new changes. And it's a really good practice to kind of learn about, especially if you're interested in full stack web development and DevOps. It's a good idea to have an understanding of all the processes that go into the software development lifecycle. And I only talked about like a very small portion of DevOps. It's not just about testing and deployments. There's so many different things, like oftentimes when you're managing many different databases, which you have to run different scripts using like bash scripting, or you need to manage different environments. We use something called Docker, which provides containerized environments for hosting applications. Really, you can do anything, like a lot of stuff with containers, and I can't really talk about it all now. But DevOps is all about managing all these different parts of the development lifecycle. But in order to learn about DevOps, you need to have a strong grasp of full stack development concepts. So it's always a good idea to kind of start with front end, back end, and DevOps is something that you can kind of practice too. So yeah, I believe we're right on schedule for the hour. But yeah, thank you so much for listening to this workshop. I hope you guys learned a few things. And I've also linked the code again in the slides so you can access them there. And feel free to ask me questions on Discord if you had anything about the workshop or you watch it later. And I can also help out if you have any questions about React or full stack development. But yeah, thank you so much. And I hope you guys enjoyed the workshop.